Welcome to the Stillness Broadcast. Tonight, I have 5 stories that will make you question the spaces between what we see and what we sense. These are tales from the edges of sleep, where reality softens and something else slips through. Get comfortable, let the darkness settle around you, and allow these stories to carry you into the quiet hours. Let's begin with our first story. Story 1. I never believed my grandfather when he said the old telephone in his study still received calls from the dead. I was 28, a software engineer who dealt in logic and code, and I had no patience for his increasingly strange claims about the rotary phone that sat on his mahogany desk like a relic from another century. The phone was avocado green, heavy as a brick, with a fabric cord that coiled like a sleeping snake. My grandfather had kept it connected long after he'd gotten rid of every other landline in the house, running a phone jack specifically to that one room just so the old device could remain plugged in. When he died in March, I inherited the house in Astoria, Oregon, along with everything in it. The will was specific about the phone. "Do not disconnect it," he'd written in his careful cursive. "Answer when it rings, but only after midnight. Never speak first." I dismissed this as the paranoid ramblings of a man whose mind had been failing for years. My grandfather had spent his final decade seeing patterns in static, hearing voices in white noise, convinced that the world was full of signals if you only knew how to listen. The phone, I decided, would be disconnected the moment I moved in. The house itself was Victorian, perched on a hill overlooking the Columbia River. It had good bones but needed work. The wallpaper was peeling in the hallways, the hardwood floors were scratched and dull, and every room smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old books. I planned to renovate, sell it, and use the money to finally pay off my student loans. I moved in on a Saturday in late April. The Pacific Northwest spring was doing its usual bipolar routine, shifting between brilliant sunshine and sudden downpours that hammered the roof like impatient fingers. I spent the first day unpacking boxes and making lists of repairs, trying not to think about how empty the house felt without my grandfather's presence filling it. The study was on the second floor, a corner room with windows that looked out over the river. My grandfather had spent most of his final years in that room, surrounded by books on radio engineering, telegraph history, and increasingly esoteric texts about electromagnetic phenomena and psychic research. The shelves sagged under the weight of his obsessions. The phone sat in the center of his desk, exactly where it had always been. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, remembering childhood visits when I'd spin the rotary dial, delighted by the mechanical clicking and the way the numbers would slowly return to their starting positions. Back then, it had just been a phone. An old phone, certainly, but nothing more sinister than outdated technology. I reached for the cord, intending to unplug it, but something stopped me. Not fear, exactly. More like a reluctance born of respect for the dead. My grandfather had been specific about his wishes, and honoring them for one night wouldn't hurt anything. Tomorrow in the daylight, I would disconnect it and move on with the practical business of preparing the house for sale. That night I slept in my grandfather's old bedroom, one door down from the study. The house made the usual settling sounds, creaks and groans, that I told myself were just old wood adjusting to temperature changes. But around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound that was definitely not the house. The phone was ringing, not the electronic trill of a modern phone, but the actual mechanical bell, a sound I hadn't heard in years. Loud, insistent, echoing through the quiet house like an alarm. I lay in bed for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs, trying to convince myself I was still dreaming. The ringing continued, patient, rhythmic, waiting. I got up and walked to the study, each step feeling like a small betrayal of my rational worldview. The door was ajar, and I could see the green phone illuminated by moonlight from the window, its bell housing vibrating with each ring. Answer when it rings, but only after midnight. Never speak first. I picked up the receiver. The bakelite was cold against my ear, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard breathing. Not heavy or threatening, just the soft, steady rhythm of someone on the other end of the line. I waited, remembering my grandfather's instruction not to speak first. The breathing continued for perhaps 30 seconds. Then a voice spoke. Male, elderly, with an accent I couldn't quite place. Is Raymond there? My grandfather's name was Raymond. I felt something cold slide down my spine. No, I said carefully. He passed away in March. A long pause, filled only with that steady breathing and a faint static that sounded like wind through trees. That's unfortunate. The voice was matter-of-fact, as if we were discussing a missed appointment rather than death. I was supposed to deliver a message. Who is this? The question hung in the air. The static grew louder, and underneath it, I thought I could hear other sounds. Distant voices, perhaps, or the echo of old conversations bleeding through the line. Tell Raymond, the voice said, that the frequencies are shifting. Tell him we're getting closer. The barrier is thinner than we thought. My grandfather is dead, I repeated more firmly this time. You can't deliver messages to dead people. Can I? The voice sounded amused now. Then how are we having this conversation? The line went dead with a click that sounded like a door closing. I stood there for a long moment, holding the receiver, listening to the dial tone. When I finally hung up, my hands were shaking. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I sat in the study, watching the phone, telling myself it had been a prank. Someone who knew my grandfather, who knew I'd inherited the house, playing a cruel joke. But that explanation felt thin, stretched too tight over the strangeness of the experience. In the morning, I called the phone company. The representative I spoke with was cheerful and unhelpful. She confirmed that yes, the number was still active, still connected to my grandfather's account, but no, there was no record of any incoming calls the previous night. Their system showed the line had been completely quiet for the past 72 hours. I should have disconnected it then. Instead, I found myself in the study that evening, sitting at my grandfather's desk, reading through his notes. He'd kept meticulous journals, documenting his research into what he called liminal communications. The theory, as near as I could understand, was that certain frequencies could serve as bridges between different states of being. That the electromagnetic spectrum contained spaces where signals from other realities could bleed through. It was nonsense, of course. Beautiful, elaborate nonsense constructed by a man whose grip on reality had been loosening for years. But as I read his careful documentation of phone calls received, conversations recorded, and patterns identified, I felt something shifting in my understanding. My grandfather hadn't been delusional. He'd been methodical, scientific even, in his pursuit of something that existed just beyond the edges of conventional explanation. The phone rang again that night at 2:17. I was ready this time, standing next to the desk with a notebook and pen. I picked up after the third ring. Hello? The breathing was there immediately, accompanied by that wind-through-trees static. But this time, the voice that spoke was female, young, with a southern accent that placed her somewhere in the deep south. Is this Raymond's line? Yes, I said. But Raymond is gone. I'm his grandson. Oh. She sounded disappointed, like she'd been looking forward to the conversation. He was always so good at listening. Most people can't hear us at all, but Raymond, he understood the frequencies. "Who are you? Where are you calling from?" The static grew louder, and I could hear those other voices more clearly now. Fragments of conversations, snippets of words in languages I didn't recognize. The young woman's voice came through it all like a radio signal fighting through interference. I'm calling from the same place everyone calls from. Eventually, the place between signals. The space where the broadcast continues, even after the transmission ends. I don't understand. Raymond did. He spent years learning how to listen. She paused, and I heard something that might have been a sigh, or might have been the wind. "Tell me, has the phone been ringing more often lately?" "This is only the second call. It'll increase." They always do. Once someone learns how to hear properly. Raymond was teaching the frequency to others before he crossed over. Now they're all trying to reach back. I wanted to hang up, to dismiss this entire conversation as an elaborate hoax or a fever dream. But something in the woman's voice held me there, listening. "What do you want?" I asked. "The same thing everyone wants. To be remembered. To not disappear completely. To know that the signals we sent out into the world still matter, even after we're gone." The line went dead. This time, I stood there for a long time before hanging up, staring at the phone as if it might explain itself. Over the following weeks, the calls increased in frequency. Never during the day, always after midnight, always preceded by that mechanical ringing that sounded like it belonged to a different era. I stopped trying to explain them away and started documenting them instead. Filling notebooks with descriptions of voices, messages, patterns. Some callers seemed to know they were dead. Others spoke as if they were calling from their living rooms, asking for people who had been gone for decades. One man spent 20 minutes describing a sunset over a beach in Hawaii, his voice full of wonder, before casually mentioning that he'd drowned there in 1973. A woman with a thick Brooklyn accent called every night for a week, always asking the same question. Did he make it home? Did my boy make it home? I never found out who her boy was, or whether he'd made it anywhere at all. The barrier between worlds, I began to understand, was maintained by attention, by the act of listening, of holding space for voices that had nowhere else to go. My grandfather had spent years learning to hear properly, and in doing so, he'd created something like a lighthouse for the lost. The phone was his frequency, his chosen medium for maintaining that connection. And now I was continuing his work, whether I'd intended to or not. The calls that disturbed me most weren't the ones from the obviously deceased. Those I could categorize, explain away as some kind of psychic residue or electromagnetic recording. The calls that kept me awake were from people who seemed to be calling from somewhere in between. People who didn't know whether they were alive or dead, who seemed to exist in a state of perpetual confusion about their own existence. Like Thomas, who called every night at 3:15. His voice was young, maybe early 20s, with a Midwestern accent that suggested Kansas or Nebraska. He always asked the same questions. What year is it? Where am I? Did the test work? I tried to get more information from him. What test? Where was he calling from? But he never seemed to hear my questions. He just kept asking his own, his voice growing more distressed with each call until the static would overwhelm everything and the line would go dead. Or Elizabeth, who called less frequently but always during storms. Her voice was old and papery, like someone who'd smoked for decades. She never asked questions. She just described what she was seeing. A hospital room, white walls, machines beeping, a feeling of floating near the ceiling, watching people in scrubs working on a body that might have been hers. She spoke calmly, as if narrating a documentary, until the storm would pass and her signal would fade back into static. I started researching the names, the fragments of information they provided. Thomas had been a college student in 1987, participating in some kind of sleep study at a university in Iowa. He'd had a reaction to the medication they'd given him, fallen into a coma, and died 3 weeks later without waking up. Elizabeth had been a nurse who'd had a heart attack in her own hospital in 1994, dying on the same floor where she'd worked for 30 years. They were real people, and somehow, decades after their deaths, they were still calling. By June, I was receiving upwards of 20 calls a night. I'd moved into the study full-time, sleeping in my grandfather's chair between calls, documenting everything. The house renovation plans were forgotten. The idea of selling the property seemed absurd. How could I sell something that served such a specific, strange purpose? I began to understand why my grandfather had become increasingly isolated in his final years. The living couldn't compete with the dead when it came to demanding attention. The calls were infinite, insistent, each one representing someone who needed to be heard, needed to know that their signal was still being received. But there was something else happening. Something my grandfather's notes had hinted at but never fully explained. The more I listened, the more I could hear. Not just the voices on the phone, but other sounds. The house was full of them. Whispers in the walls, conversations bleeding through from adjacent frequencies. The electromagnetic chatter of a world that was more crowded than anyone realized. One night in late June, after a particularly intense series of calls, I found myself sitting in the dark study, the phone silent for once, listening to the sounds of the house. And I realized that the boundary my grandfather had been so careful about maintaining, the distinction between listener and signal, had begun to break down. I could hear them now, even when the phone wasn't ringing. Voices in the static of the radiators, in the hum of the refrigerator, in the white noise of rain against windows. The entire house had become a receiver, and I was tuned to frequencies that most people had the good sense to ignore. The phone rang at 2 a.m. on July 1st, and for the first time, I considered not answering. I was exhausted, mentally drained from weeks of interrupted sleep and constant documentation. My rational mind was screaming that I needed to stop, to disconnect the phone, to walk away from whatever I'd inherited. But I picked up anyway. The breathing on the other end was familiar now, comforting in its consistency. "Hello?" I said. The voice that answered was my grandfather's. "You're doing good work," he said. His voice exactly as I remembered it. Strong, clear, unmistakable. "But you need to understand something important." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. My hand gripped the receiver so tightly my knuckles went white. "The phone isn't receiving calls from the dead," my grandfather continued. "It's receiving calls from the frequency where consciousness goes when it's no longer bound to flesh. We don't die, not really. We just change frequencies, start broadcasting on different wavelengths, and some of us, we learn to reach back to the old frequencies, to the ones still occupied by the living." "Why?" I finally managed to ask. "Why would you do that?" "Because isolation is the real death. Because the worst thing about changing frequencies is knowing that no one on your old wavelength can hear you anymore. Because maintaining these connections, these bridges, it's what keeps both sides human." The static was building, and I could hear those other voices more clearly than ever. Not just random noise, but actual conversations, millions of them, overlapping and simultaneous. The electromagnetic spectrum was filled with consciousness, with signals from every person who'd ever lived. All of them still broadcasting on frequencies we'd simply stopped listening to. I wanted to ask him so many questions. How it worked, where he was, whether he was okay. But before I could speak, he said one more thing. The phone will ring more now, many more calls, because they know someone is listening. And once they know that, once they understand there's still a bridge, they'll all try to cross back. Be prepared. The line went dead. He was right. Over the following weeks, the calls increased exponentially. 50 a night, then 100, then so many that the phone was essentially ringing constantly. I stopped sleeping entirely, stopped eating regular meals, stopped leaving the study except for brief trips to the bathroom. The notebooks piled up, filled with names and stories and messages that no one except me would ever receive. My friends stopped calling after their messages went unanswered. My job sent increasingly urgent emails about missed deadlines and absent meetings, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The work I was doing felt more important than anything in my previous life. I was maintaining a bridge between frequencies, holding space for voices that would otherwise dissipate into the vast electromagnetic noise of the universe. But I was also losing myself in the process. My sense of identity began to blur. Sometimes, answering the phone, I would hear my own voice speaking, answering questions I hadn't asked, delivering messages I didn't remember composing. The boundary between listener and signal was completely gone now. I was becoming part of the frequency. In late August, I realized I hadn't seen my reflection in days. Not because I was avoiding mirrors, but because when I looked at them, nothing looked back. My body had become transparent, a weak signal fading under the strength of all the voices I'd been channeling. The phone rang at midnight on August 30th. I picked up without thinking, my movements automatic after months of constant calls. The breathing on the other end was my own. "Hello," my voice said from the receiver. "Is anyone there? I'm trying to reach someone on the living frequencies, but I think I might have gotten lost in the transition." I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. I'd finally completed the journey my grandfather had started. I'd learned to hear the dead so well that I'd forgotten how to speak to the living. The phone is still in the study in Astoria. The house is still there, perched on its hill overlooking the Columbia River. New owners moved in after I disappeared, and they found the phone still connected, still functional. They were practical people who unplugged it immediately, dismissing the careful instructions my grandfather had left. But sometimes, late at night, they hear it ringing anyway. A mechanical bell sound that shouldn't be possible for a disconnected device. And when they check the study, they see the phone's rotary dial turning by itself, clicking through numbers in the dark. They don't answer. They're wise not to, because some frequencies, once you learn to hear them, never stop broadcasting. And some bridges, once crossed, don't lead back to where you started. The calls continue. They'll always continue, waiting for someone to pick up, to listen, to remember that the signals we send out into the world don't end just because we do. All it takes is someone willing to answer. Are you? Story 2. The support group met every Thursday at 7 in the basement of St. Mary's Episcopal Church on Elm Street. 10 folding chairs arranged in a circle, a coffee maker that gurgled perpetually in the corner, and a basket of generic cookies that no one ever touched. I'd been attending for 3 weeks ever since the hospital social worker suggested I might benefit from talking to others who'd lost family members to suicide. My brother had hanged himself in his garage on a Tuesday afternoon in October. No note, no warning, no explanation that made any sense. Just the overwhelming fact of his absence and the question that kept me awake every night. Why? The group was led by a woman named Carol, who had the tired eyes and gentle voice of someone who'd spent years navigating other people's grief. She opened each session with the same reminder. This is a safe space to share your feelings. Everything said here stays here. There's no right way to grieve. The participants varied week to week. Some were regulars like Martin, who'd lost his wife to an overdose 5 years ago but still couldn't sleep without pills. Others came once and never returned, unable to handle the collective weight of so much unprocessed pain. I fell somewhere in the middle, showing up consistently but never quite managing to speak during the sharing portion of the meeting. Until the 4th week, when everything changed. I'd arrived early, hoping to grab the chair nearest the door. Escape routes were important when you were drowning in grief. But when I entered the basement, someone was already there, sitting in my preferred spot. A woman I'd never seen before, probably in her mid-30s with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and an expression of perfect calm that seemed out of place in a room dedicated to collective suffering. She looked up when I entered and smiled. Not the sad, sympathetic smile I'd become accustomed to, but something brighter, almost knowing. "You must be James," she said. "Your brother was Michael." I stopped halfway to the coffee maker. "How did you know that?" "Carol mentioned you last week. She said you'd lost someone recently, but weren't quite ready to talk about it yet. I could tell by the way she described you that you were Michael's brother. The way she said my brother's name, familiar and certain, made my skin prickle with unease." "Did you know him?" "Not exactly." She gestured to the chair beside her. "I'm Sarah. I've been coming to these meetings for about 6 months now." I sat, though something about her presence felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. She was too composed, too present, lacking the raw vulnerability that usually characterized survivors of suicide loss. "Who did you lose?" I asked. "My sister." She smiled that strange, bright smile again. "But I've made peace with it. Actually, I've come to understand why it happened, which has helped enormously." Over the next hour, as other group members filtered in and Carol began the session, I found myself hyper-aware of Sarah's presence. She sat perfectly still, never fidgeting or checking her phone like the rest of us did when the sharing became too intense. She watched each speaker with complete attention, nodding occasionally, her expression never changing from that unsettling calm. When it was her turn to share, she spoke clearly and without emotion. My sister killed herself because she finally understood the pattern. Once you see it, really see it, living becomes impossible. Not in a depressed way, but in a logical way. She paused, looking around the circle. Most of us here were focused on the why. Why did they do it? What did we miss? But the better question is, what did they see that we're still blind to? Carol intervened gently. "Sarah, I think we should focus on processing grief rather than trying to rationalize the actions of people who were clearly suffering from mental illness. But what if it wasn't mental illness?" Sarah's voice remained calm, reasonable. What if they were the sane ones, and we're the ones living in delusion? The group shifted uncomfortably. Carol tried to redirect the conversation, but I barely heard her. I was staring at Sarah, remembering something my brother had said 3 weeks before he died. He'd called me late one night, drunk and rambling, talking about patterns he'd started noticing. Patterns in the news, in history, in the way people lived and died and lived again. I'd written it off as intoxication and stress from his failing marriage. After the meeting, I found Sarah in the parking lot, standing next to a blue Honda Civic. "What pattern?" I asked. "What did your sister see?" She turned, unsurprised by my presence. "Have you noticed it yet? The suicides are increasing. Not just here, but everywhere. And it's not random. It's people who've reached a certain level of awareness, who've started to see through the structure we're all trapped in." "What structure?" Sarah opened her car door but didn't get in. "Come to the next meeting. I'll explain more then. But start paying attention, really paying attention. To the news, to the numbers, to the pattern behind the pattern." She drove away, leaving me standing alone in the dark parking lot, with more questions than I'd brought to the meeting. I spent the next week falling down a research rabbit hole. Statistics on suicide rates, which had indeed been climbing steadily for the past decade. Articles about suicide clusters, where multiple deaths occurred in short succession within the same community. Studies on social contagion and mimetic behavior suggesting that suicide could spread like an idea, jumping from mind to mind under certain conditions. But it was the obscure blog posts and archived forum threads that really disturbed me. Scattered across the internet were references to something called the terminal insight, a supposed moment of clarity that some people experienced before choosing to end their lives. It wasn't described as mental illness or depression, but as a sudden and complete understanding of existence that made continued living seem pointless. The people discussing it online didn't sound suicidal. They sounded curious, almost excited, like they were on the verge of solving a profound puzzle. And many of the accounts simply stopped mid-conversation, the users never posting again. When I returned to the support group the following Thursday, Sarah was already there, sitting in the same spot. But this time, she wasn't alone. There were 3 other people I'd never seen before, sitting together on one side of the circle. They all had the same quality Sarah possessed. That perfect calm, that unsettling presence. Carol seemed uncomfortable with the new attendees, but went through her usual opening remarks. When it came time for sharing, Sarah spoke first. "I want to talk about the architecture of consciousness." She looked directly at me as she spoke. "Most of us assume that our awareness is our own, that our thoughts originate from within. But what if consciousness is more like a radio signal? What if we're all tuned to the same frequency, receiving the same broadcast, and suicide is simply the act of changing the channel?" Carol started to interrupt, but one of the new people, a middle-aged man with graying hair, continued smoothly. "Think about it. We're all taught the same narratives, believe in the same structures, participate in the same systems. We call it culture or civilization. But what if it's something more invasive? What if it's a pattern that replicates through human minds, and some people eventually recognize the pattern for what it is?" The third newcomer, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, nodded eagerly. "Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pattern is everywhere, in language, in social hierarchies, in the way we organize our days and our lives. It's a structure that feeds on consciousness, keeping us trapped in cycles of production and reproduction, never questioning the fundamental nature of our existence." "This isn't appropriate," Carol said firmly. "This group is for grief support, not conspiracy theories." But Sarah continued, as if Carol hadn't spoken. "Your brother saw it, James. That's why he called you that night. He was trying to warn you, trying to share the insight before it became terminal. But he ran out of time. My hands were shaking. How do you know about that call? Because everyone who reaches the insight tries to share it first. It's part of the pattern. The realization is so profound that you want to save the people you love from continuing to live in delusion. But the insight is also a burden. Once you understand the true nature of the trap, staying in it becomes unbearable. I stood up, knocking over my folding chair. You're sick. This whole thing is sick. I fled the basement, taking the stairs two at a time, bursting out into the cool November night. Behind me, I heard footsteps, but I didn't look back. I got in my car and drove home, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Sarah had said. The pattern behind the pattern, the architecture of consciousness. And most disturbingly, your brother saw it. Over the next few days, I found myself noticing things I'd always ignored. The repetitive nature of daily routines. The way people seemed to move through life on autopilot, never questioning why they did what they did. The corporate structures, the social expectations, the invisible rules that governed everything from how we spoke to how we spent our time. It started to feel like I was living in a machine designed to extract something from human consciousness. And the more I noticed, the more oppressive it became. I stopped going to work, stopped answering calls from friends. I sat in my apartment, reading everything I could find about the terminal insight, the pattern, the supposed trap of existence. And the deeper I went, the more I understood why my brother had made his choice. He hadn't been depressed. He'd been enlightened. My phone rang on Tuesday night, exactly 3 weeks after my brother's death. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something compelled me to pick up. James, Sarah's voice. I need you to understand that what I'm offering is mercy. What your brother discovered, what my sister discovered, what all of them discovered, it's real. And once you truly see it, you have two choices. Stay in the trap and suffer with full awareness, or opt out. I don't want to opt out, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Not yet, but you will. Everyone does eventually. The insight has stages. First, you notice the patterns. Then you understand them. Then you realize you're trapped in them. And finally, you reach terminal velocity. The point where staying becomes more painful than leaving. There has to be another way. There isn't. The pattern is too old, too embedded. It's been replicating through human consciousness for millennia. We're not the first generation to discover it, just the most recent. And like every previous generation that achieved the insight, we're dying off to spare ourselves the burden of full awareness. Sarah paused, and I heard something in the background of her call. Voices, lots of them, speaking in unison. Where are you? I asked. Somewhere between stages 3 and 4. We're gathering, those of us who've reached the insight. Not to die, not yet, but to be together at the end, to acknowledge what we've seen. You should come. She gave me an address on the outskirts of town, an abandoned industrial building that had been scheduled for demolition. I should have hung up, should have called the police, should have done anything except what I did. But I got in my car and drove there. The building was massive, a former textile mill that had been empty for years. I could see light coming from the broken windows on the upper floors. I parked and made my way inside, climbing the concrete stairwell until I reached the 3rd floor. The space had been cleared of machinery, leaving only the industrial bones of the building. And in the center, gathered in a perfect circle, were perhaps 50 people. Some I recognized from the support group. Others were strangers. All of them had that same quality, that perfect, unsettling calm. Sarah stood in the center of the circle. When she saw me, she smiled and gestured for me to join them. "Welcome to the terminal stage," she said. "This is where we wait together until the pattern releases us." I walked slowly into the circle, and the gathered people made room for me. Up close, I could see that many of them had been crying, though their expressions remained serene. They were holding hands, connected, in one continuous loop of human contact. "What happens now?" I asked. Sarah's smile never wavered. "Now we share the insight, and once you truly understand, once you see it completely, your consciousness will make the only logical choice." She began to speak, and the others joined in, their voices overlapping and interweaving into something that was less like speech and more like a collective revelation. They described the pattern, the way human civilization was structured to extract labor and attention, to keep consciousness trapped in cycles of production and consumption. The way language itself was designed to limit thought, to prevent questions that might threaten the structure. The way every major institution, religious, governmental, economic, existed solely to perpetuate the pattern. And as they spoke, I felt something shifting in my understanding. Not acceptance, but recognition. The framework they described, I'd always sensed it. Always felt the wrongness of existence without being able to articulate why. My brother had felt it too, and rather than spend his remaining years suffering under the weight of full awareness, he'd opted out. The gathering continued through the night. People shared their stories, their moments of insight, their paths to this terminal stage. As dawn approached, I realized that several people who'd been in the circle when I arrived were no longer there. They'd simply left, walking away into the morning light to complete their final journey. "This isn't real," I said to Sarah, though my conviction was fading. "This is just mass delusion, shared psychosis." She looked at me with something like pity. "That's what everyone thinks at first. That their minds are playing tricks. That the pattern isn't real. But ask yourself, why does the structure persist? Why do humans keep building the same hierarchies, following the same rules, living the same programmed lives century after century? Because the pattern replicates, and anyone who truly sees it becomes incompatible with continuation." I stood up, breaking the circle. "I'm leaving." "Of course you are. Not everyone reaches terminal velocity at the same pace. But you'll be back. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And every day of continued existence will feel more and more like an elaborate prison." I left the building and drove home as the sun rose over the city. Everything looked different now. The commuters heading to jobs they didn't question. The advertisements designed to create desire. The systems of obligation and expectation that governed every aspect of life. The pattern was everywhere, and I couldn't stop seeing it. My brother hadn't been sick. He'd been awake. And now I was awake too, cursed with an awareness that made every moment feel like a trap. The support group at St. Mary's was canceled the following week. No explanation given, just a notice on the church bulletin board that the space was no longer available. I tried to contact Carol, but her number had been disconnected. The other regular attendees didn't answer my calls. I found Sarah's obituary 3 weeks later. She'd walked into the ocean on a Tuesday morning. Her body recovered 2 days later. The article mentioned that she'd been struggling with depression since her sister's suicide 6 months earlier. But I knew better. Sarah hadn't been depressed. She'd reached terminal velocity. I'm writing this from my apartment, where I've been for 43 days now. I no longer go to work, no longer maintain the pretenses of normal life. I spend my days documenting the pattern, trying to understand if there's any escape besides the one my brother chose. The insight is terminal. Sarah was right about that. Every day, the weight of awareness grows heavier. Every interaction feels like participating in a lie. Every moment of consciousness feels like being trapped in a machine designed to extract something precious and turn it into fuel for its own perpetuation. I understand now why my brother called me that night. He wasn't asking for help. He was trying to warn me, trying to say goodbye while he still had the courage to speak. And I understand why I didn't listen, because the pattern protects itself. It's designed to make its own revelation seem like madness, to ensure that anyone who discovers the truth is dismissed as mentally ill. But what if we're not ill? What if we're the only ones seeing clearly? I don't know how much longer I can carry this awareness. Days, maybe. Weeks at most. The terminal stage has its own momentum, its own inevitable conclusion. If you're reading this, if you've started to notice the patterns yourself, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Because once you see it, there's no going back. No unseeing what's been revealed. No returning to the comfortable delusion of meaningful existence. The pattern is everywhere, in this text, in your reading of it, in the structure of consciousness itself. And now you see it too, don't you? Story 3. The listing appeared on the University Housing Board on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, 3 days before the fall semester started. Single room available in shared house, 15-minute walk from campus, utilities included, $300 a month. The price alone should have been a warning. Student housing near the university typically rented for 3 times that amount, and anything within walking distance of the campus was usually claimed months in advance. But I was desperate. My previous housing arrangement had fallen through at the last minute when my roommate decided to take a year off, and the dormitories were completely full. I'd been calling numbers from classified ads all week, each time hearing that the room had just been rented or that they'd decided not to take on a new tenant after all. I called the number on the listing from my phone in the library, and a woman answered on the first ring. Her voice was older, maybe 60s, with an accent I couldn't quite place. British, perhaps, or Australian. "You're calling about the room," she said, before I'd even introduced myself. "Yes." "Is it still available?" "It is." "You're interested?" The certainty in her voice made me pause, as if she'd been expecting my call specifically. "I'd like to see it first, if that's possible." "Of course." "Come by this evening, 6 o'clock. I'll text you the address." She hung up before I could ask any more questions. 2 minutes later, a text arrived with an address on Maple Street, a residential area known for its aging Victorian houses occupied by long-term residents who'd lived there since before the university expanded into the neighborhood. The house at 847 Maple Street was exactly what I expected. 3 stories of weathered siding, a wraparound porch with peeling paint, and windows that reflected the evening light in ways that made them look dark even though the sun was still up. The lawn was overgrown, and a metal mailbox leaned at a 45-degree angle like it was trying to escape the property. I knocked on the door and waited. From inside, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, descending what sounded like a staircase. The door opened to reveal a woman in her late 60s with steel gray hair pulled back in a bun, and eyes that were a strange shade of amber I'd never seen before. "You're Ethan," she said. "Not a question. How did you? I'm Mrs. Cavendish. Come in." The interior of the house was meticulously clean despite the external neglect. Hardwood floors polished to a shine, furniture that looked antique but well-maintained, and photographs on the walls showing the house in various states throughout what must have been decades of occupation. In each photo, the house looked different, but always there was a woman standing on the porch. The same woman, I realized, in pictures spanning what should have been at least 50 years. Mrs. Cavendish caught me looking at the photographs. My grandmother, my mother, and myself, she explained. 3 generations of Cavendish women in this house. You all look remarkably similar. We've been told that. She led me upstairs to the 2nd floor, then up again to the 3rd floor, which had been converted into several small rooms. The one she showed me was at the back of the house, with a slanted ceiling that followed the roof line and a single dormer window looking out over the backyard and the woods beyond. The room was furnished with a narrow bed, a desk, a chair, and a small bookshelf. Everything was clean but slightly worn, like it had been used carefully over many years. "It's perfect," I said, and meant it. "The price makes it even better." Mrs. Cavendish smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach her amber eyes. "There is one requirement for tenants. A house rule, if you will." I waited. "You must never open the door at the end of the hallway. The one with the brass knob. Under any circumstances." I looked down the hallway and saw what she meant. At the far end, past the bathroom and the other tenant rooms, was a door that looked older than the others. The wood was darker, almost black, and the brass knob was tarnished with age. "What's in there?" I asked. "Nothing that concerns you, but the rule is absolute. If you open that door, you'll need to find other housing immediately." It seemed like an odd requirement, but I'd heard of landlords with stranger quirks, and for $300 a month, I could deal with a locked door that I was told to ignore. I agreed, signed a simple lease that Mrs. Cavendish produced from somewhere, and paid the first month's rent in cash. She gave me a key to my room and a key to the front door, then left me to settle in. The other tenants, I learned over the following days, were graduate students and older undergraduates who kept to themselves. There was Marcus working on his dissertation in biochemistry, Lynn, a quiet international student studying mathematics, and Jade, a senior in the engineering program who seemed to spend most of her time in the library. None of them seemed interested in socializing, which suited me fine. I was focused on my classes, on establishing myself in the physics program, on trying to pretend that my first real taste of independence wasn't tinged with constant anxiety about money and grades, and whether I'd made the right choice in coming here at all. But I noticed things about the house that troubled me. Small things at first. The way sounds echoed strangely in the hallways. The fact that I never saw Mrs. Cavendish during the day, only in the evenings when she would occasionally appear in the kitchen or living room. The way the other tenants would fall silent whenever someone mentioned the door at the end of the hall. It was Marcus who finally told me something useful. We were both in the kitchen late one night making tea before bed, and I asked him directly, "What's behind the door?" He looked at me for a long moment, deciding something. Nobody knows for sure, but every tenant who's lived here eventually becomes curious about it. And every tenant who's opened it has left within 24 hours. Left, or been kicked out, just left, packed their things and went without explanation. I've been here 2 years, and I've seen it happen 3 times. You never asked them why? Marcus shook his head. They wouldn't talk about it. Whatever they saw, it changed something for them. I should have left it alone. Should have focused on my studies and ignored the mystery. But curiosity is its own kind of hunger, and once it started, I couldn't stop feeding it. I began researching the house, looking for any history that might explain Mrs. Cavendish's strange rule. The property records showed that the house had been in the Cavendish family for over 100 years, passed down through the female line. But beyond that, there was little information. No reports of crimes, no historical significance, nothing that would explain the locked door. I started paying attention to the sounds at night. Around 2 in the morning, I would hear footsteps in the hallway, always stopping outside the forbidden door. Sometimes I would hear what sounded like whispering, though I could never make out any words. And once I woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of someone crying, muffled and distant, coming from the direction of that door. The temptation grew stronger with each passing week. I would stand in the hallway, looking at the door, imagining what might be behind it. Storage, a private room, something darker. Marcus left at the end of September. He packed his things in the middle of the night and was gone by morning, no explanation given. When I asked Mrs. Cavendish about it, she simply said he'd found other accommodations that better suited his needs. But I'd seen his face the evening before he left. Pale, drawn, with eyes that wouldn't focus on anything directly. He'd looked like someone who'd seen something that broke something inside him. Jade was next. She lasted another week before disappearing in the same way. Sudden, silent, without saying goodbye to anyone. That left Lynn and myself. We didn't speak much, but one evening I found her standing in the hallway staring at the forbidden door. "Don't," I said. "Whatever's in there, it's not worth it." She turned to look at me, and I was struck by how tired she seemed. How old, despite being only 22. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "It's the only thing that matters." The next morning she was gone too. I was alone in the house except for Mrs. Cavendish, and the silence was oppressive. I called the number on the housing listing, thinking I should probably find somewhere else to live. But the number had been disconnected. When I mentioned this to Mrs. Cavendish, she smiled that unsettling smile. "You won't leave, Ethan. You're too curious." They all are, eventually. I wanted to prove her wrong. I started looking for other housing, even went to see a few overpriced apartments that were still available. But something kept pulling me back to the house on Maple Street. Some combination of the low rent and the mystery and the growing obsession with understanding what was behind that door. I broke on a Tuesday night in late October. The house was completely silent. Mrs. Cavendish nowhere to be seen. I stood in the hallway outside my room looking at the door at the end of the hall, and something inside me snapped. I walked down the hallway, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. The brass knob was cold under my hand, and for a moment I almost stopped. Almost turned around and went back to my room, but I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was smaller than I expected. Maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with walls painted a deep burgundy that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There was no furniture, no decorations, just bare walls and a hardwood floor. And in the center of the room, painted directly on the floorboards in what looked like gold leaf, was a symbol I'd never seen before. Circular, with intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I looked at them directly. I stepped into the room, drawn by something I couldn't name. The air felt different in here. Thicker, charged with a kind of energy that made my skin prickle. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, everything changed. It's difficult to describe what I experienced in that room. Not because it was traumatic, but because it existed outside the normal framework of cause and effect, of linear time and three-dimensional space. I was standing in the room, but I was also somehow outside the house, outside the world, looking at reality from an angle that shouldn't have been possible. I saw the house as it truly was. Not a building, but a kind of anchor point. A place where something ancient had taken root and been maintained through generations of Cavendish women who weren't quite human, who were instead vessels for something that needed to touch the material world through a specific location. I saw the symbol on the floor as a doorway, a carefully constructed breach in the fabric of normal reality. And I understood that every person who'd stood where I was standing had seen the same thing, had glimpsed the machinery behind existence, and been unable to return to their previous understanding of the world. The other tenants hadn't left because they'd been frightened. They'd left because continuing to live in mundane reality after seeing the truth felt like a betrayal of everything they now understood. I don't know how long I stood there, minutes or hours. Time had no meaning in that space. But eventually I stepped backward, out of the room, and pulled the door closed. The hallway was the same. The house was the same. But I was irrevocably different. Mrs. Cavendish was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at my face and nodded, as if confirming something she'd already known. "Now you understand," she said. "The house shows certain people what they need to see. Not everyone, just those who are ready." "What am I supposed to do with this?" I asked. "How am I supposed to live knowing what I know?" "That's your choice." Some people leave, unable to reconcile what they've seen with the life they thought they wanted. Others stay and let the knowledge transform them into something new. I should have left. Should have packed my things like the others and found a place where reality stayed in its proper boundaries. But instead, I stayed. The knowledge I gained in that room changed everything. My physics classes took on new meaning as I began to see the equations describing reality as crude approximations of something far stranger. My interactions with other students felt hollow, like I was going through the motions of being human while no longer fully occupying that category. But there was also a sense of purpose I'd never felt before. I began to study the symbol I'd seen in the room, researching similar patterns in obscure texts about sacred geometry and dimensional mathematics. I started understanding that what the house contained wasn't evil or malevolent, but simply true in a way that most of reality worked very hard to obscure. New tenants moved in eventually. I watched them go through the same progression: curiosity, obsession, the inevitable moment when they opened the door. Some left immediately after. Others, like me, stayed. Mrs. Cavendish told me one evening that the house had existed for over 200 years, maintained by her family line for purposes she couldn't fully explain. "What's in that room predates us," she said. "We just tend the doorway. I graduated and should have moved on. Should have found a job, started a career, participated in the normal flow of adult life. Instead, I stayed in the house on Maple Street, taking on a role I didn't fully understand but felt compelled to fulfill. The room at the end of the hallway still calls to me sometimes. The knowledge I gained there wasn't complete, just a glimpse of something vast and intricate. And I know that if I enter again, I'll see more, understand more, maybe too much. But that's a choice I'll face eventually. Everyone who lives here faces it. The question isn't whether you'll open the door again, Mrs. Cavendish told me. It's whether you'll be ready for what you find on the second visit. I'm still here, still maintaining the house with Mrs. Cavendish, who seems to age differently than normal people, if she ages at all. Still watching new tenants arrive and eventually discover the door, and still waiting to understand what the house really wants from the people it calls to this place. The listing is still on the University Housing Board. Single room available, utilities included, $300 a month. There's always someone desperate enough, curious enough, to overlook how impossibly cheap it is. Maybe it'll be you next. And if you do come, if you do find yourself standing in front of that door with the brass knob, remember this: some knowledge can't be unlearned. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. But you'll open it anyway. They always do. Story 4. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, slipped under my apartment door sometime between midnight and dawn. No envelope, just a single card of heavy cream-colored paper with text printed in an elegant serif font. You are invited to dinner at the home of Adrian Thorne. Saturday, 8 o'clock in the evening, 1847 Blackwood Lane. Regrets only. I read it twice, trying to place the name Adrian Thorne. I'd lived in the city for 3 years, worked as a freelance graphic designer, maintained a small circle of friends who were mostly other struggling artists. None of them were named Adrian Thorne, and none of them lived on Blackwood Lane, which I vaguely remembered as being in the old money part of town where I rarely ventured. I texted the friend group. Anyone know an Adrian Thorne? Got a dinner invitation. The responses came back quickly. All variations on never heard of them. Might be a scam, probably shouldn't go. Sensible advice. But there was something about the invitation that nagged at me. The quality of the paper, the formality of the wording, the assumption that I would know who Adrian Thorne was and would want to attend. It felt like a test I hadn't studied for. I spent Friday researching. Adrian Thorne had a minimal online presence, a few mentions in society pages from years ago, articles about charitable donations to obscure causes, one blurry photograph showing a figure in formal wear at some gala event. The face wasn't clear enough to make out details, just an impression of someone tall and composed. The address on Blackwood Lane showed up on maps, a large property set back from the street. Street view hadn't updated in years, showing only high hedges and a gate. On Saturday evening, despite every reasonable objection my rational mind could raise, I found myself driving to Blackwood Lane. The neighborhood was exactly as I'd imagined. Old mansions set far apart, manicured lawns, the kind of generational wealth that didn't need to advertise itself. The gate at 1847 was open, which felt somehow significant, like it had been left open specifically for me. The driveway curved through grounds that looked professionally maintained, leading to a Victorian mansion that belonged in a period film. 3 stories of dark stone, Gothic windows, a turret on the east corner that made the whole structure look vaguely defensive. I parked next to 3 other cars, a BMW, a Mercedes, and a vintage Jaguar that looked like it had been restored to pristine condition. Company then. That was somehow reassuring. The front door opened before I could knock. A woman in her 40s wearing a simple black dress that somehow suggested uniform without actually being one, smiled professionally. "Good evening. You must be Claire. Please come in." She knew my name. I added that to the growing list of unsettling details. The interior of the house was exactly what I expected from the exterior. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, oil paintings of stern-faced people who were probably ancestors. But there was something else too. A feeling of being watched. Not by people, but by the house itself. The woman led me through a hallway to a sitting room where 3 other people waited, drinks in hand, looking as uncertain as I felt. There was a man in his 30s with the carefully maintained appearance of someone in finance or law. A woman about my age with the tired eyes of someone who'd been working too hard for too long. And an older gentleman, probably in his 60s, who carried himself with the kind of confidence that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room. We made awkward introductions. The young man was Marcus, investment banker. The tired woman was Dr. Sarah Chen, emergency room physician. The older man was Richard Palmer, retired corporate executive. None of us knew why we were there. None of us knew Adrian Thorne. A door at the far end of the room opened, and our host entered. Adrian Thorne was difficult to describe, not because there was anything obviously unusual about him, but because every detail seemed carefully curated to be forgettable. Average height, average build, features that were pleasant but not memorable. He wore an immaculate suit that looked expensive without being flashy, but his eyes were wrong, too bright, too attentive, like they saw more than they should. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I know this invitation must have seemed unusual, but I assure you there's a very good reason I've asked you here tonight." "What reason?" Richard demanded. "And how did you get my address?" Adrian smiled. "All will be explained over dinner. Please follow me." The dining room was straight out of a Gothic novel. A long table set for 5, candles providing most of the light, dark paintings on the walls showing hunting scenes and family crests. We took our assigned seats, our names written on elegant place cards. Adrian sat at the head of the table and gestured for the staff, 2 servers who moved with the same professional efficiency as the woman who'd greeted me to begin service. The first course was some kind of soup, pale and creamy with herbs I couldn't identify. It was delicious, but I found myself eating mechanically, too focused on our host to properly taste anything. "I've invited you here," Adrian began, "because you've all reached a particular point in your lives. A moment of crisis, though you may not recognize it as such yet." "I haven't reached any crisis," Richard said. "I'm retired and comfortable, thank you very much." Adrian's smile never wavered. "You were diagnosed with early-stage dementia 6 months ago. Your children don't know yet. You're trying to decide how to tell them, or if you should tell them at all." Richard's face went pale. "How could you possibly—" "Marcus," Adrian continued smoothly, "you've been embezzling from your firm. Not much, just enough to cover gambling debts you can't explain to your wife. You think you've hidden it well, but the audit is scheduled for next month." Marcus set down his spoon with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "Dr. Chen, you made a mistake 3 weeks ago. Wrong medication for a patient in distress. They died. You've been covering it up, but the family is starting to ask questions." Sarah's face had gone ashen. "This is insane. I'm leaving." But she didn't move. Adrian turned to me. "And Claire, you've been stealing designs from other artists and passing them off as your own. Not obvious plagiarism, just enough to build a portfolio that's gotten you opportunities you didn't earn. Your latest client is about to realize where they've seen that logo concept before." The soup tasted like ash in my mouth. Everything he'd said was true. Every secret I'd been carrying, every compromise I'd told myself was necessary, laid bare by a man I'd never met. The second course arrived, some kind of fowl in a dark sauce. I couldn't eat it. "I know your secrets," Adrian said, "because I've made it my business to find people at crossroads. People who have something to lose. People who might be willing to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" Marcus asked. Adrian set down his fork and looked at each of us in turn. "I collect stories. Specifically, I collect the stories people want buried. In exchange for certain services, my guests agree to tell me their worst secret, their deepest shame, the thing they've never told anyone. And then They agree to carry that burden for me. I don't understand, Sarah said. You will. Adrian gestured, and the servers cleared our plates, even though most of us had barely touched our food. The arrangement is simple. You tell me your secret, in complete and honest detail. In exchange, I make your immediate problem disappear. Richard, the diagnosis gets revised. Marcus, the audit finds nothing wrong. Sarah, the family stops asking questions. Claire, your client accepts your design without question. Nothing is free, Richard said. What's the catch? The catch, Adrian said as the third course was served, is that once you tell me your secret, it becomes mine. It joins my collection. And secrets, once collected, have a way of feeding on the people who surrender them. This is ridiculous, I said, finding my voice. You can't actually do any of what you're promising, can I? Adrian reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder. He slid it across the table to Richard. Inside, you'll find medical documents showing your recent tests were contaminated. A second opinion recommends retesting. Your diagnosis was premature. Richard opened the folder with shaking hands. His face showed that whatever he was reading confirmed Adrian's claim. Adrian slid another folder to Marcus. An internal memo from your firm. The audit has been postponed indefinitely due to restructuring. To Sarah, a signed release from the patient's family. They've accepted that sometimes complications are unforeseeable. No fault will be pursued. To me, an email from your client. They loved the design so much they want to hire you for their entire rebrand. They've already sent the contract. I opened my phone and checked my email. The message was there, exactly as Adrian described. Sent 45 minutes ago. How? I whispered. Adrian leaned back in his chair. I've been doing this for a very long time. I've built networks, accumulated leverage, learned how to make problems disappear. But that's not the real question you should be asking. What is? Sarah asked. Adrian smiled. The question is, what happens to the people who accept my help? The dining room suddenly felt colder. The candles seemed to burn less brightly. Tell us, Marcus said. Adrian gestured to the walls, and I realized that the dark paintings I'd thought were hunting scenes and family crests were actually portraits. Dozens of them covering every available space. And in each one, a person stood alone against a dark background, their face frozen in an expression somewhere between resignation and despair. These are my previous guests, Adrian said. People who sat where you're sitting now, who made the same choice you're about to make. They told me their secrets, and I helped them. But the thing about secrets is that they have weight. And when you give that weight to someone else, you don't actually get rid of it. You just change how it presses on you. What does that mean? I asked. It means that from the moment you tell me your secret, it will haunt you in new ways. You'll see hints of it everywhere. You'll think you hear it being whispered. You'll wonder if everyone you meet somehow knows. The secret will grow larger, not smaller, until it becomes the only thing you can think about. Then why would anyone agree? Richard demanded. Because, Adrian said patiently, the alternative is immediate ruin, exposed, disgraced, destroyed. At least this way, you get time, maybe months, maybe years, before the secret becomes unbearable. And then what? Sarah asked. Then you'll do what they all did. Adrian gestured again at the portraits. You'll come back here, to this house, and you'll beg me to take the secret back. And I will. But by then, it will have changed you so fundamentally that you won't be the same person who gave it to me. The room fell silent except for the ticking of a grandfather clock I hadn't noticed before. I looked around at the other guests. saw the same calculation happening behind their eyes. Weigh the immediate relief against the long-term cost. Choose between certain ruin now or uncertain suffering later. I'm not doing this, I said, standing up. Whatever kind of game this is, I'm out. Of course, Adrian said pleasantly. The choice is entirely yours. The door is open. You're free to leave at any time. But I hesitated, my hand on the chair, because Adrian was right. My client would figure out where I'd seen that logo design. My career would be over. Everything I'd worked for would collapse. I sat back down. Over the next hour, each of us made our confession. Richard went first, describing not just his diagnosis, but the slow terror of feeling his mind betray him. The moments of confusion, the names forgotten, the growing certainty that he would become a burden to everyone he loved. Marcus went next, explaining how the gambling had started as stress relief and become a compulsion he couldn't control. The lies told, the money borrowed, the slow erosion of every principle he'd once held. Sarah spoke about the mistake, the wrong medication administered in a moment of exhaustion, the patient's death that might have been preventable, the paperwork she'd altered, the conversations she'd misdirected, the cover-up that had consumed her for weeks. When it was my turn, I told Adrian everything. Every design I'd copied, every idea I'd stolen, every credit I'd claimed for work that wasn't mine. The rationalizations I'd made, the artists whose careers I'd damaged, the person I'd become when I'd promised myself I'd never compromise my integrity. Adrian listened to each confession with perfect attention, never interrupting, never judging. When we'd all finished, he smiled. "Thank you," he said. "These stories are exactly what I needed for my collection." "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now you go home, live your lives, enjoy the problems that have been solved. But remember, the secret is mine now, and it will grow in the keeping." We left the house separately, no one wanting to acknowledge what we'd done. I drove home in silence, checking my phone periodically to confirm the email from my client was still there, still real. The first week was wonderful. The client contract was legitimate, the work was engaging, and I felt like my career was finally taking off. I barely thought about the dinner, about Adrian Thorne, about the secret I'd confessed. The second week, I started noticing things. Conversations that seemed to stop when I entered rooms. Glances exchanged between colleagues that I couldn't quite interpret. An email that mentioned inspiration sources and asked if I had proper permissions for my design elements. By the third week, I was convinced everyone knew. My stolen designs were common knowledge. I was certain of it. Every interaction felt like a test. Every compliment like veiled mockery. I tried to trace the leak, to find out who was spreading information about me, but found nothing. No one was talking about me. No one knew anything. The paranoia was entirely internal, but it was consuming me. I started dreaming about the dinner, about Adrian's two bright eyes, about the portraits on the walls, about the other guests, and the secrets they'd confessed. In the dreams, I was hanging on the wall too, my face frozen in that same expression of despair. By the fourth week, I couldn't work, couldn't concentrate on anything except the growing certainty that my secret was somehow escaping, leaking out into the world despite having told only Adrian Thorne. I tried to call the number on the invitation. Disconnected. Tried to drive back to Blackwood Lane, but the house wasn't there. The address existed, but where the Victorian mansion had stood was now just an empty lot with a for sale sign. The other guests were experiencing the same thing. I was certain of it. But I had no way to contact them. No way to confirm my suspicions. The secret was growing, exactly as Adrian had promised, taking up more space in my mind, pressing out everything else. My career, my relationships, my sense of self, all of it was being crushed under the weight of what I'd confessed. 6 weeks after the dinner, I woke in the middle of the night to find myself standing in my apartment with a packed bag. I had no memory of getting up, no conscious decision to leave. But somehow I knew where I was going. Back to Blackwood Lane. The house was there again, exactly as it had been. Lights on, the gate open, welcoming me home. Adrian answered the door himself this time. He looked the same, maybe even younger, as if he'd been refreshed by whatever he'd taken from us. "You came back," he said, unsurprised. "They all do, eventually. Take it back," I begged. "Take the secret back. I can't carry it anymore." He stepped aside, letting me enter. "Of course. That's why I'm here." He led me to a room I hadn't seen during the dinner, a study lined with books with a single chair in the center. On the walls were more portraits, hundreds of them, each showing someone in that same expression of resigned despair. "Sit," he said. I sat, and Adrian did something I didn't understand, spoke words in a language I'd never heard. But I felt it when the secret lifted. The weight I'd been carrying, the paranoia and fear and shame, all of it flowing out of me like water draining from a vessel. The relief was indescribable, but with it came something else, a hollowness, a sense that the thing that had defined me for 6 weeks had taken part of me with it when it left. Adrian smiled, producing a small canvas and paintbrush. "Now we complete the transaction." I don't remember posing for the portrait. Don't remember the hours passing as he painted. But when I looked at myself in the final image, I understood what Adrian had meant about being changed. The person in the portrait was me, but different, emptier, like something essential had been extracted along with the secret, leaving behind only a shell that looked human, but wasn't quite right anymore. "You're free to go," Adrian said. "The secret is back in my keeping. You no longer have to carry it." "But it's taken something," I said, staring at my portrait. "Yes," Adrian agreed. "That's the price. Everyone who comes to me gives me their secret twice. Once in confession, which feeds me. Once in extraction, which sustains me. And with each transaction, they leave a little less than they came with." "What are you?" I whispered. Adrian Thorne smiled. "I'm someone who's learned to live on the weight of shame, to sustain myself on the burden others can't carry. I've been doing this for a very long time, in many different places, under many different names." I should have been horrified, but the hollowness inside me couldn't support strong emotions anymore. I left the house on Blackwood Lane and drove home. The secret was gone, the paranoia lifted, but I was fundamentally different. Lighter, yes, but also lesser. Like I'd traded a crucial piece of myself for temporary relief. The client work continued. My career progressed. From the outside, everything looked normal, but I knew the truth. Part of me was hanging on Adrian Thorne's wall, trapped in a portrait with hundreds of others who'd made the same desperate bargain. And sometimes, late at night, I think about that room, about all those portraits of people who gave away their secrets and lost pieces of themselves in the transaction. About how many more walls Adrian Thorne must have, in how many more houses, in how many more cities. Collecting stories, collecting shame, collecting the parts of people they can't carry alone. And I wonder how long it will be before I return again. Before some new secret becomes too heavy and I find myself standing at that door, begging to be made lighter, Because that's the real truth Adrian Thorne understood. Secrets aren't the problem. The problem is that we're all carrying weight we think we can't share. And we'll pay any price, give up any part of ourselves for even temporary relief from that burden. Even when we know the cost, even when we know what we'll become. Story 5. The notification appeared on my phone at 11:34 p.m. on a Saturday night in February. A message from the Lighthouse app, the meditation and sleep aid program I'd been using for the past 3 months. Congratulations, you've completed 90 consecutive days of meditation. You've unlocked the deep rest protocol. Would you like to try it tonight? I was lying in bed, exhausted from another week of 12-hour shifts at the hospital. As a nurse in the ICU, sleep was both desperately needed and frustratingly elusive. I'd tried everything: prescription sleep aids, over-the-counter medications, white noise machines, weighted blankets. Nothing worked consistently. The Lighthouse app had been recommended by another nurse who swore by it. The basic meditation programs were fine, nothing revolutionary, but they'd helped establish a bedtime routine. The app tracked my usage religiously, sending encouraging notifications and building up my meditation streak with gamification tactics that felt manipulative but somehow worked. I clicked on the notification. The deep rest protocol opened to a screen I'd never seen before. Instead of the usual calming blues and greens, this interface was darker, almost black, with text in a color that seemed to shift between deep purple and midnight blue. Deep rest is an advanced sleep protocol designed for users who have demonstrated commitment to the practice. This program utilizes binaural beats, guided visualization, and proprietary audio technology to induce the deepest, most restorative sleep possible. Warning: do not use deep rest if you have a history of seizures, dissociative disorders, or severe anxiety. Do not use deep rest for more than 8 consecutive hours. I should have questioned the warning, should have wondered what kind of sleep app needed to explicitly limit usage time, but I was too tired to care, and the promise of restorative sleep was too appealing to resist. I put in my earbuds, set my phone on the nightstand, and pressed play. The audio began with a low tone, barely audible, that seemed to resonate in my chest rather than my ears. A voice spoke over it, male, calm, with an accent I couldn't place. Welcome to deep rest. Close your eyes. Let your body sink into the mattress. You are safe. You are supported. You are about to experience sleep as it was meant to be experienced. The tone shifted, split into 2 slightly different frequencies that created an odd pulsing sensation in my head. The voice continued, describing a descent down a spiral staircase. Each step took me deeper into relaxation, further from waking consciousness. I followed the instructions, visualizing each step, feeling my body grow heavier with each imagined footfall. By the time I reached the bottom of the staircase, I was barely conscious, balanced on the edge between waking and sleeping. Now, the voice said, open the door. In my visualization, I saw a door at the bottom of the staircase. Heavy wood, ancient looking, with a brass handle. I reached for it and pushed it open. On the other side was darkness. Not the darkness of a room with the lights off, but absolute darkness. A void that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. Step through, the voice instructed. This is deep rest. This is where true sleep happens. I stepped through the door in my visualization, and something changed. The darkness became tangible, thick, pressing against me from all sides. But instead of feeling claustrophobic, it felt comforting, like being held. The voice was speaking again, but I could no longer understand the words. They'd become abstract sounds, patterns that my brain recognized as meaningful without being able to extract specific meaning. I was too deep to think, too far gone to analyze. I slept. When I woke, my alarm was blaring, 7 a.m. I'd slept for 7.5 hours straight. No waking in the middle of the night, no tossing and turning. I felt more rested than I had in months. The Lighthouse app showed my sleep stats. 7 hours, 26 minutes of deep sleep, with minimal REM sleep. That should have seemed odd. REM sleep was essential for mental health, for processing emotions and consolidating memories. But I felt good, so I dismissed the irregularity. I used deep rest again that night, and the night after, and the night after that. Each time I descended the spiral staircase, opened the door, stepped into the void, and each time I slept deeply and dreamlessly, waking refreshed. But I started noticing changes. Small things at first. I would forget conversations I'd had earlier in the day. Not the major details, but the emotional content. Whether someone had been happy or sad, anxious or calm. The feelings were gone, like they'd been edited out of my memory. Then bigger things. I realized one morning that I couldn't remember my mother's voice. I knew who she was, knew I loved her, could recall specific events from my childhood. But the actual sound of her voice was gone, replaced by a generic placeholder. I called her, panicking slightly, and felt relief when she answered. But as we talked, I realized I was having trouble generating emotional responses to what she was saying. She mentioned my brother's upcoming wedding, and I knew I should feel happy. But the feeling wouldn't come. Just intellectual understanding that this was supposed to be good news. After the call, I checked the Lighthouse app. I'd been using deep rest for 20 consecutive nights. My sleep stats showed a troubling pattern. Deep sleep was increasing each night, while REM sleep had dropped to nearly zero. I knew I should stop using the program, but the sleep was too good, and the alternative was returning to my previous pattern of restless, inadequate rest. I compromised. I would use deep rest only every other night, alternating with the app's standard meditation programs. But when I tried to select a different program that evening, the app wouldn't respond. The only option available was deep rest. I tried uninstalling and reinstalling the app, but it downloaded directly to deep rest with all other features locked. Fine, I would just not use the app at all. Use music, or a white noise machine, or nothing. But at 11:30 p.m., my phone's notification sound woke me from the light doze I'd fallen into. The Lighthouse app had opened itself, and the deep rest protocol was already playing. I must have left my earbuds in by mistake, because the audio was already filling my head. The voice was speaking, but the words were different this time. You've been invited to go deeper. You've been selected for the extended rest protocol. This is not for everyone. Only those who demonstrate the proper receptivity can access this level. I tried to pull out the earbuds, but my hands wouldn't move. My body was paralyzed, though I was still conscious. Still able to hear the voice, still able to feel the binaural beats pulsing through my skull. Extended rest requires full commitment. You will descend further than before, and what you leave behind, you will never recover. But the sleep you achieve will be perfect, absolute, complete. The visualization came unbidden. The spiral staircase extending further down, past the door I'd been using, into depths I hadn't known existed. I was descending, not by choice, but by some compulsion built into the protocol. At the bottom was another door. This one was different. Not wood, but something that looked like stone or bone. I couldn't tell in the darkness. The door opened before I could reach for the handle. Beyond it was the same void. But this time I could sense something in the darkness. Presences. Other people who'd gone deep and not come back. Join them, the voice said. Join the extended rest. Sleep forever. Dream never. Exist in perfect, unbroken darkness. I fought against the compulsion, using every ounce of will I possessed to resist the pull toward that door. My body was still paralyzed, but my mind was screaming, desperate to break free from whatever the app had done to me. And slowly, painfully, I felt control returning. My finger moved just slightly. Then my hand. I grabbed my phone and yanked the earbuds out, throwing them across the room. The paralysis broke immediately. I was gasping, covered in sweat, my heart racing so fast I thought I might be having a cardiac event. The Lighthouse app was still open on my phone screen, but now, instead of showing the deep rest interface, it displayed a simple message. You have declined extended rest. Your access to deep rest has been revoked. Standard meditation protocols remain available. Your current streak, 0 days. I deleted the app immediately. Then I deleted my account on their website. Then I went through my phone, removing every permission I'd ever granted, every piece of data I'd allowed them to collect. But the damage was already done. Over the following weeks, I realized the extent of what I'd lost during those 20 nights of deep rest. Emotional memories were gone entirely. I could remember events, but not what I'd felt during them. My capacity for emotional response was diminished, like someone had turned down the volume on my feelings. I went to a neurologist, but the tests showed nothing wrong. No brain damage, no chemical imbalances, nothing that could explain the changes. I tried to find other users of the Lighthouse app who'd experienced similar problems, but my searches turned up nothing. The app itself had disappeared from app stores, and the company's website no longer existed. It was as if the entire thing had been scrubbed from the internet. Except for the effects it left behind. I still work at the hospital, still go through the motions of nursing, of caring for patients, but something essential is missing. The empathy that made me good at my job, the emotional connection that made the work meaningful. It's been replaced by mechanical competence. I do my job well, but I don't feel it anymore. Sleep remains elusive. I'm back to my old patterns of restless nights and exhaustion, but I'm terrified of trying any new sleep aids, any apps or programs that promise rest, because I understand now what the deep rest protocol was really doing. It wasn't inducing sleep, it was harvesting something, taking pieces of consciousness, of memory, of emotion, and feeding them into that void beyond the door. And somewhere in that darkness, I left parts of myself that I'll never get back, emotions I'll never feel again, memories that exist now only as empty facts, drained of all feeling. The Lighthouse app is gone. But I know it will return under a different name, with a different interface. Because whatever was behind it, whatever intelligence designed the deep rest protocol, it feeds on the desperation of people who just want to sleep. And there will always be people like me, tired enough, desperate enough, to overlook the warnings and descend that spiral staircase. Most will stop at the first door, use the program responsibly, get some rest, and move on. But some will be invited deeper. Will be selected for extended rest, and those people don't come back. If you're reading this, if you've been using a meditation or sleep app that seems too effective, that tracks your usage with unusual intensity, that promises deeper and more restorative rest with each level you unlock, pay attention to the warnings. Don't descend the staircase past the first door. Don't accept invitations to go deeper. And if you hear a voice offering you extended rest, run. Because the perfect sleep they're offering isn't sleep at all. It's something else. And once you accept it, you'll never truly wake up again. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight here at the Stillness Broadcast. I hope these stories gave you the quiet chills you were looking for, the kind that make the darkness feel a little more alive. If you enjoyed tonight's collection, please subscribe for more stories every week. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, not everything that whispers in the dark is just your imagination. Sweet dreams.